Thank you all for being here. Glad to have you. We're here today at Telematic Media Arts. My name is Buckner. I'm the director, and I'd like to welcome you to an In Conversation with artist Kurt Hentschlager in conjunction with and on the occasion of his exhibition here at Telematic, Unease Oasis. Unease Oasis. To make it official, I'm going to introduce Kurt by reading an abbreviated bio, and then we'll get down to it. And my thought is that I would begin this In Conversation with a series of questions, largely taking us through the work in the show and unpacking Kurt's work from there. And then I hope we can open up the floor to a broader discussion. So, New York-based Austrian artist Kurt Hentschlager creates media installations and performances for both physical and virtual venues. Hentschlager's works have characteristically been visceral and immersive and are known for their perceptual effects. They challenge an audience psychologically, but also offer a meditative respite from the day-to-day stress of digitally enhanced life. His representational body of work suggests a semi-synthetic form of nature that serves as a metaphor for our life in the Anthropocene. Hentschlager's work embraces experiment and an interdisciplinary approach, most prominently displayed in his ephemeral audiovisual environments and live shows in between fine arts, music, and theater. In Hentschlager's work, Kurt's work has been presented internationally, among other places, at the Venice Biennale, at ZKM in Karlsruhe, at the ICC Tokyo, Museum for Contemporary Art Seoul, and elsewhere. He lives and works in Staten Island, New York. So, without further ado, Kurt.
That's true.
Yeah, welcome.
Thank you.
So again, as a point of departure, I thought we could begin with this centerpiece in the show, yes? The Exit Unease Oasis, right? Also the inspiration for the title here. Could you take us through it, sort of how this comes to be? And
Yeah, sure. But I would like to first start by thanking you for bringing me out right to the show. And as I said a couple of times already, this is an unusual format for me. Usually I don't do gallery shows. I do more like special projects, or however you want to call this. And I used to do a lot of performance, which later merged a bit more into installation work, right? Which there's a word called performative installation, which in a way points to this fact that it's not your usual super still installation. So there's several moving factors, and particular also it addresses the recipient, the audience member, which is always a crucial element of every show, because a lot of them are phenomenological and do things that then happen on a personal basis. That said, it's really interesting that I much appreciated. It's a little bit like work of it goes all the way back to 1996, right? That's like a granular synthesis piece. It's a collaboration I did with Ulf Langheinrich between 93 and 2003 about. So that goes way back, but everything else is about 10, 15 years back, right? This is the newest piece from now, and this is the pandemic piece. Well, this is a response to the pandemic, which came about because a colleague, Chris Salter, invited me in about 3 months into the pandemic. He had lined up a show in Poland where I think I would have been invited anyway also, which then became an online show for obvious reasons. And at that point, I wasn't working in the studio. This was maybe early summer in 2020. I was actually building a garden in the backyard. It was like a wilderness and actually a dump site, which I found once I started. And so yeah, so I did not spend time in the studio, and that brought me back. And it reflects to a good extent like the weirdness of that moment, the particularities of that moment. Like, you know, for me that was like to live all of a sudden in one location from one season to the next, which I hadn't done in, was it 2020? I had not done this in 30 years. I was always traveling. I was always like experiencing spring several times over in various degrees in different locations. So all of a sudden I was in the same place every day, and because I went out, I was in the garden, like working in the garden. So I saw things like, you know, this weird mushroom, this, what is it called, like this kind of strange sexual somewhat, right, appearance, which is a really not well smelling thing that only happens for like a day, that comes up, it's filled with air on the inside, and it secretes a slimy, stinky something on the outside, and that attracts flies. The flies eat it or they feast on it, and by doing so they take up spores and then, you know, bring the spore, transport spores to other places. And I saw that. There was nothing, all of a sudden there was this, it was like sort of magical. So I took out my film camera, which I haven't used in ages, or like my video camera, and shot it. And that was actually before I started on this piece. There was something that had happened already. And so yeah, the piece came about in this particular strange moment that was so unusual, right? And such a departure, such a break in everyday's life, as we all remember. In the case of myself and you know, Claudia, my wife, who lived in this house and garden, initially not that much changed because we live and work in the same place, so we work from home anyway, except there was no more outings in the city, no more meeting friends, no more something, right? It was like, that was the only difference. Yeah, and then there were, so what's in there also, without wanting to explain this like too much, because I like the oddity of it really, and the many seemingly disconnected parts, like, you know, what the hell are the cats all of a sudden, stuff like this. I probably never thought I would ever use cats. There was another recording I did years earlier, the friend's home, where we were cat sitting. And that for me was like this kind of signifier of like a purely domestic moment, right? And then, yeah, you create your own, you know, stage sets, you create your own. There was a cultural period in Austria, in the, this is bad, I think 19th century, called Biedermeier. And Biedermeier is the middle class, the emerging middle class in the Industrial Revolution that prospers, and because it prospers and it becomes prominent, wants to participate, wants some share in power. And then was a monarchy, obviously, with a Kaiser, and the chancellor of the Kaiser, Metternich, was a really nefarious character, very dictatorial, very autocratic, and he wiped these emerging, you know, political aspirations. He wiped them out, like completely said, okay, you have a choice, you know, shut up and do whatever you want in your own homes, but other than that, we will, you know, put you in prison and wipe you out. So what the middle class did then is they built these beautiful homes. All the energy went into the homes, right? Into the houses, into the decor, the strike, the design, the events, right? Cultural events were all then private, semi-private. And so the pandemic reminded me somewhat of this sort of Biedermeier. Everybody, you know, like with a passion, the vengeance, started to redecorate, right? And like, you know, because there was nothing to do. There was a lot of excess money. So yeah, that's a little bit, I think, reflected in there as well. Even though outside of the garden, but nothing changed. There was no design vengeance really in our lives, but still, it was palpable.
Yes, and in terms of the analogy you're drawing there, right, sort of registering this broader thing that's happening in the city or in the country, but all of its strangeness, being experienced within the domestic scene.
Yeah, exactly. And then, there was also at the same time, right? There was like a lot of upheaval. There was like also political, right? There was like Black Lives Matter,
Yes.
all this kind of things, and then of course the polarization between the left and right. So it was a politically really turbulent times, ongoing.
Yes.
So yeah.
Well, the ongoing too, just to say, right, that for me, that this is a pandemic piece is vivid, right, and it's tangible. But the pandemic, maybe especially here in San Francisco, right, these are still strange times, and we're recovering, and but new crises, new instabilities, uncertain futures, right, that it speaks beyond the pandemic as well.
Yeah, totally, because for me this is like an ongoing crisis. Things have changed really, really like a lot, right? I mean, there was so much damage, and so many of institutions or places I used to work that literally went out of business, right? I mean, despite all the subsidies and whatnot. So I think there's a big turnover happening generally. Which ultimately is always a good thing. Change is good, so there's nothing wrong with that. But that was really severe, and plus, of course, the inflationary pressures, right? So this, for instance, I was lined up for like a performance in the UK, and it was like more of an expensive piece, and they were ready finally to do it. The pandemic had sort of finished. And then they ran the numbers, and all of a sudden the costs had doubled. So they said this is impossible. Like we can't do this. So we shifted to another performance, which was more affordable. So that it did happen. But once I was there, this was very, very fascinating. It was a World Theater, so good funding, serious funding. But they literally have cut the program less than in half. Because this is what they about can do with the budget that's the same, but the costs are like this, right? So yeah, it's ongoing, for sure.
And this piece then, Paradox Park, is, as you mentioned, the most recent, 2022?
23.
2023.
Yeah.
In a way, I guess the question is sort of moving from here, into this piece, is it registering sort of these ongoing uncertainties and so forth? I suppose the other thing too is that your work has long dealt with contradictions and paradoxes and antinomies, and I wonder sort of about this as this particular experience, both personally and socially, and then sort of the broader strain of this kind of critical line of thinking in your work. Maybe first of all, sort of what's going on here, and how you understand it speaking, but then again, how it connects up this unease with, I guess, broader dynamics.
Yeah. So that is a prototype, right? This is it's a work in progress I'm working on. It will really publish in 2024 at some point. Quite a bit of process involved in this one. Motion capture, right? These individual human heads. First of all, that are motion captured in various degrees of display of emotion and states of mental states, if you will. And in that respect, it connects to this piece, which is called Sweetheart, which comes out of a time, this is 96, this comes out of a time when the discussion then was early digital days still, late early days. It was all about like cyborgs and the way that that digital technology would reframe and influence our core behaviors and habits and way of thinking and working together, communicating. And so, and that was like a dystopian reading of that. So there was this idea of like, it's alive, it's human, not human, right? It's a zombie state of sorts. So that is like Kemi Takeya, a Japanese performer who lived in Vienna, or still lives in Vienna. And we had a dedicated recording with her, which is similar to what what's the plan for that. Like I will capture, but now not with video, but with the 3D, apparatus, aka iPhone, really. It's still almost the same, except it captures more, if you will. And we asked Akemi then the session was for about an afternoon, and we asked to display certain emotions, like with a lot of anger and then upsetness and this, but also stillness. She was classically like performing in a Japanese way, the traditional way she was, educated, trained. It was really beautiful. Some singing, like subtle things and really expressive things. And then with that catalog of motions and moods, we created sort of this library of tiny little snippets, of audiovisual snippets, because we recorded not just the movement of the head, but also the sound of the head. Right? And then it got built over a long period of time into the stream of zombie-esque sort of loop-based, single-frame video editing sort of based thing. So this obviously goes beyond that, because otherwise why come back to it for that long? And what I like particularly in this prototype, that it speaks a little bit to this, that we are caught up in our own, because this is such a selfie moment. I think we've become so hyper aware of who we are, what we are doing at all times, through this media mirroring, that we are just actively participating and enabling every day, right? And what that does to us, and how it's sort of a feedback loop, a weird feedback loop. But in the bigger scope, this is revisiting like what I call hysteria 2.0. Again, coming back to the 19th century, it is sort of a topic of mine lately. Like at the end of the 19th century, what is a very unscientific, from today's perspective, diagnosis of psychological behavior, right? Hysteria, is not used for obvious reasons any longer, and was particularly pinned on women then, versus I think in the male domain it was labeled melancholia, but as a matter of fact, a lot of men were hysterics as well at the time, because they couldn't cope with the speed of change and with a drastic, quite abrupt change in society and in the way of going about life through technology at the end of 19th century, and this explosion, right, out there. So I keep thinking that we're reliving a hysterical moment, and that is politically, in terms of the anxiety about the future, about what's going to happen with climate change, sustainability, economic balance and fairness, right? All these sort of things. So it's like this weird fraught moment, and we do not like to really look at it. That's anyway, I'm quite, most of us sort of are in denial, right? We hope that, my age anyway, we hope we'll be dead before this really totally blows up. But let's say your children, Clark, right, have none such privilege. So however positive to feel, and because if you're young, you're positive by default, or you're like optimistic. But there must be anxiety, there must be, like an understanding that this is going to be a hard future. It's not going to be an easy-go-lucky future, right? Lots of places. So, yeah, that's like the topic. For me, the general outlook. I wanna make something where but you can either experience as a VR. It's called Paradox Park. From Sculpture Park somehow, where you wander through a big void emptiness, and then you come about clusters of human heads that are stuck in place, right? Like a little bit like Easter Island, like the big Easter Island statues that are just sitting there forever, imprisoned in a way in this location, but also signaling a past, the past glory of a civilization. So there's much what's the word? It's a memorial to a life that is already past, but we don't acknowledge in a way. And they're upset, right? They're upset, they're in agony, they're depressed. So this is a psychological wasteland, if you will. It's not a happy place. I mean, there will be happy moments, because otherwise it's too depressing. There will be some, faint smiling at times. But more that you think, is this real? Or, it's weird.
The reference to hysteria seems apropos insofar as one of the things that distinguishes hysterics is that they, or at least classically, right, that they suffer their psychology physically, in physical symptoms.
Yeah, exactly. Tics and whatnot.
Yeah, I, in a way, sort of anticipating your remarks, was interested to ask about the body as, I suppose, maybe firstly as a subject matter, right? Again, even this mushroom, is it a nipple? Is it a phallus? It's like a strange sort of body, and certainly here in Cluster, right, with these bodies swirling around, and again in the Sweetheart piece. Can you speak to that, right, as sort of the body as a central concern?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's right, that the body also goes to in a way, more to the animalistic part of us, right? Because there's not a clear-cut distinction, but there's generally, our head as a sort of the center of intellect, sensory organs, communication, and also, of course, like in control of nervous system and everything. But if we interact with each other, we focus really on our heads, eyes, right? What do we say, and how do we, and the body recedes in the background normally in intellectual discussions. But then everything else that often is the salt of life, right? And the beauty of life, the body obviously is very prominent, right? Like be this moving through the world, dancing, sex, just name it, right? Interaction really with the world, beyond the intellect. So, yeah, I think we're ignoring, for obvious reasons, or we feel, this is also a point of hubris, we feel we are not animals, right? We are civilized, conscious beings, and we are post-animal, but we're absolutely not. And I think the main reason is that at the end of the day, most of our decisions or consequential decisions are still driven by emotions and instinct and quick reactions without thinking too much. So yeah, there's always this contrast between what we think the way we want to be and the way we actually still are, right? And there's another aspect to it, like, because we're so conscious with all our accomplishments, we also in denial of this whole idea that we have to die. That's another big thing. We really don't like this whole concept of our eventual demise. And I felt for a long time this obsession with technology, which is really like controlling, improving the environment and ourselves, is is a conspiracy ultimately of overcoming this general problem that we have to die. Which really, if you look at it from another perspective, is not a problem, it's actually a good thing. Because I think if you're, let's say if you are immortal, that's like that's a really quite intense prison, right? That you can't get out of it in a way. Well, yeah. So body versus mind, I think. I think that's very much the Western condition, rather than a unity, right, or like a cohesion, more of a cohesion. Not even talking about, like certain religions like Protestantism, which even try to completely separate them as much as possible.
Yeah. Let me ask a related question. In a way, sort of thinking about the body as a subject matter here, but as we, began with your bio and so forth, right? A lot of your projects are not representational in the way in which this work is, right? And they're more directly experiential. And this, in some ways, is a different body of work. This is video work. In subtitling the show, Affective Intensities, though, I meant to be evoking that dimension of this work too, right? Mm-hmm. And to say that, insofar as it's representational, it evokes meaning and symbols and psychology and association. But there really is, and we've got the sound turned down, but that's certainly a key feature of it, right? There's this direct kind of visceral experience of the work. And can you speak about that sort of, do you mean to be targeting the body? I guess that's what I mean to say is that the experience isn't necessarily one of spectatorship, right? But one where you're undergoing and experiencing in a more immediate, and it's kind of intense insofar as it doesn't allow for the kind of distance that reflection and representation involve.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So this is not a visual show, right? This is a very, how do you say this, a controlled show, obviously, right? In my big installations and live shows, there's certain elements who are decisively on another level, let's say outside of the intellect, at least initially, like infrabass, right, sub-bass, which touches the body and goes through the body, vibrates the body. It's like, and then loudness. Loudness is as a form of intensity that envelopes you, that it creates a sort of sonic architecture within a given actual architecture. All these installations, particularly the fog work, the fog and stroboscopic work, and the darkness work, where you go into a space there's zero light, and you have to you lose your sense of your visual sense, at least in the beginning, are meant to disconnect you from day-to-day reality. And for me, this is mostly effective or interesting because it takes you out of your day-to-day perceptual habits. Right? This for me for a long time was some of the most interesting fields of research to understand human perception, or my perception to begin with, right? And in the beginning I thought, okay, this is all about the mechanics, if you will, of perception, the way the brain works, and the eyes, and what happens in the what cortex, and then it gets separated out in processes, and eventually comes back together. It's actually quite complex to form the image of the world, right? But all along, this is like accompanied by an enormous process of interpretation, like analytical process, interpretational process, and culturally informed habits of perception, meaning the way where you grew up, the way you grew up, you know, yeah, I mean, cultural frameworks are amazingly formative, well, obviously, and then the other big part is mood, your particular mood. Let's say, how do you perceive the world when you are in a good mood or in a bad mood, right? This famous saying, what's this, the way you, like in German it says, wie du in den Wald rufst, so kommst zurück, meaning the way you shout into the forest, it will come back at you, right? If you're angry and aggressive, you will find people who are angry and aggressive, or you will get into fights a lot. So that defines how you experience the world, like clearly, and dramatically differs, just mood-wise, from day to day. And so these installations are in a way trying to shake you in the beginning, shake you to just lose your, how do I put it? To just wake up out of your framework, out of your usual kind of framework, and by doing so, become actually a moment of meditation or respite, or you forget about the outside. And there's always like for me the important thing is there's a gate one way or the other. There's a zone you have to pass through. Like in the fog shows, it's a double-doored gate. So the outer door leads you into the gate, and then there's like slightly hazy from before, and the door closes, then the inner door opens, and there's this wall of fog, right? And you barely see some stretched ropes, and then you go in, and the door closes, and then you're in this completely unreal world where you have no reference. And the darkness piece is similar. You walk in. Your vision goes from daylight vision to night vision. That's an adaptive process, takes about 10 minutes. So in the beginning you see really very, very little. And ever so often there's light, and then you do see the space, and you have after images. You see a lot, but it's nothing like what we see, like now, right? Where we understand this is a space. This is people, this is me, walls, It's very comforting, right? This is perfect comfort zone. You're safe, no dangerous sounds, no earthquakes. And so you go into this other zone, and it's not so different, but it's different enough that all of a sudden, your comfort zone has to go away for that moment. And that, I hope anyway, and I think, and allows for certain things to happen, right? For certain, reconnections inside of your being. Mm. Yeah, that's the plan.
Yeah. In a way, maybe sort of approaching that topic again, but thinking about the form of the work, and maybe the form of the work in this show in particular, in this Sweetheart piece, there's a real sense, I want to say, of the materiality of the image, right? That there are these clips, and the clips are being repeated, and in their repetition, they have this effectively jarring effect, right? And it's again, you're not necessarily sort of seeing it, but you're also like being struck by it in this percussive fashion. And that idea of, again, sort of knowing that there's this real strong sense of like a visceral experience in your work. Again, it seems like at the level of the form, there's a kind of materialism, yes? Mm-hmm. And a sense of the materialism of the image, I want to say. On the other hand, well, that's a little weird. We're talking about video, which is already, ephemeral like it is, or even, now working in these sorts of contemporary 3Ds and the kind of motion capture that you're describing, right? There's, in some ways, it's very immaterial, and abstract. And I don't know if that's too sort of open-ended a question, but can you speak to that, sort of the material and the immaterial in the image?
Yeah, I mean, maybe a good opportunity to speak about the idea of the loop also. I mean, freezing and time base, because that work, let's say a work like it's I think important to understand, like three-part, the entire the length of the original material used in there is maybe 5 seconds, and that becomes 7 minutes, right? So there's a lot of repetition in there, and a lot of small increments of change, and it's all loop-based, which in a way also relays this idea of being stuck or caught, right, or being frozen in this kind of condition, and which gives sort of the weird reanimated sense, right? So just being dead and alive at the same time. But with everything loop, because the loop is not something that was invented by media, right? It's like a human loop, and humans is like, intertwined forever. Like all the rituals, right? All religion. Everything religion is all loop based, because it's about transporting people in another realm, trance states, to disconnect from day-to-day reality, right? To go into what's it called, heightened experiences, and that is something like to create like hypnotic states, or something where you forget about the passing of time. It's like, it's about this weird ambiguity, like time stands still or moves faster, depending on how you, again, feel at the moment. But either way, the usual time, the experience of time is altered dramatically. And that does weird things, right? Like, I think C is a good example. I mean, I don't know, might as well ask Derek, who was in Leipzig, right? Derek, did you think the time you spent in there, what did you think about the length of time you spent in there?
Kind of lost track of time.
A lot of time?
Lost track of it.
I actually don't know how long it actually was.
Yeah. Yeah, because also like you're fully distracted, like you don't think about, right? It's like it's a condition, it's an expanded moment, if you will. So, yeah, it's this psychological component to it that is everything loop has the potential in there, right? To be transported, I think, and that I find. I don't know, it's one of my main, I mean, so this is an outlier in a way, except for this mini loop of the cat, which, like repeats a couple of times. But generally this is about as linear as it gets.
Right.
And,
but there is definitely still a sense of disorientation, and there is a sense of a suspended time.
Yeah.
Yeah. Indeed. It's interesting too that that's the response to the question about the materialism of the image, is to say time,
But
and then to say that the malleable phenomenology of time. Yeah.
But which, by the way, is a banality in a way, because everything media is about interrupting or changing a continuous experience of time, right? Film is like a complete condensation usually, right? Like 1.5 hours later you went through a lifetime of somebody or something. Mm-hmm. So this is, but I mean, I had a couple of experiences when I was young that sort of I find so totally fascinating. I was addicted to them. Like there was one, for instance, where every Christmas we would go for like a couple of hours to former neighbors where we used to live. And so I would, especially when I was then not even living in Linz anymore, would go there and seeing the neighbors and the friends from time past once a year for 3 hours every year. And the years passed, and then this is it. And so strangely enough, I realized that a new continuity formed in each of us. Is like a completely compressed but still perfectly continuous time over the years, right?
And you actually knew each other very well.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, well, how well can you can you know each other if you see each other 3 hours per year?
We work together.
But still, right? So we have this ability to redefine everything into a continuity, time-wise, and that goes with this whole idea that we always have to make sense of stuff, right? We cannot, we put things in order, in context, and in sync, and that's just one of our abilities, of our many abilities to survive.
You may have touched on this already somewhat, but what is the stuckness here, right? Between the sweetheart, that, like you talk about the zombie there, or this paradox prototype here. There's a sense of, actually even the figures in the cluster piece, right? There's sort of a sense of being stuck. Is that specific for you, and does that have a relationship to time and change? And
yeah, it's also about this whole idea about being the question whether you are in control or not, right? Of your destiny, I think. Like this general notion of, but in the West more than in the East, I think. In the East, you're always like part of a collective, right? So there's not that much the idea that you're an individual, I'm an individual, we are masters of our domain mostly, and I think ultimately that's another illusion. It's like the illusion of control and illusion of safety, all these kind of things. But like in cluster, you have this it's about, I think, 20 bodies who are interacting with each other, who are driven by outside forces. It's unclear whether they are actually voluntarily moving around. And at times it's quite beautiful, right? Like a flock of birds or something, or fish, a school of fish. But actually they are, if you look closer, it is quite brutal, because they're clashing into each other with high speed. So if they were real human beings, there would be a lot of shattered bones. And they are sort of attracted to each other and like violently, right? So they form clusters, and then they are rejecting each other equally violently. So there's like a tidal sort of movement that outside forces throw them around and move them. Which is really what it is. It's like, like zero gravity VR beings that then are subjected to constantly changing gravity forces and like including, like if they come together, this is because all of them become super heavy for a moment, and a point in the space is defined where they are attracted to, right, as an anchor, as a gravity anchor.
is that how the algorithm works?
Yeah, well, I developed that for a period of time between, I think, 2004 and 12, with consecutive iterations of work like that.
And to introduce that it's a generative piece, right?
Yeah,
in other words, it's not a composition.
ran over a computer.
It's
Never quite the same, and it's accompanied by this drone soundscape, which does not really reflect the intricacies of their movement. It's more like an overall background, a universal background drone. But each of them, is an instrument, musically speaking. They each make sound.
Well, that's part of the algorithm too.
Right, and then together they create this overall, mass of sound that is sort of there. So they're choir, if you will, a weird choir, but it's not voluntary, I would think. And plus, if you could see them, you don't. They don't have faces, right? So they're really just bodies, anonymous bodies.
Mm.
They're called ragdolls in 3D language. They're like, if you take the arm and pull them up, the whole body follows the movement. You can move them around and stuff like that. So they're not rigid. They're flexibly. But that for me, anyway, that piece was really the big topic. And that goes back to, talking about philosophy, right? Like a long time ago, I read this book of this German philosopher who was super hip at the moment. And now that I'm talking about it, of course I don't remember. It's called Euro-Taoism something. Oh my God, this is so embarrassing.
We can track it down. We can track it
Sloterdijk.
down.
Oh, Sloterdijk.
Oh yeah, sure.
So it's this German...
Neo-fantasy?
Huh?
No, the individuology guy. Sloterdijk.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so he wrote this book, the first book I wrote, pretty much describing and this was really the topic, saying, okay, so we are all free, independent individuals, right? That's the premise. And so how come that in all our individuality, we end up doing pretty much the same? Like whether, we all want cars, we all want televisions, we all want to go on vacation at the same time of the year, right? This sort of, and then we all get stuck. Like the idea there is no freedom of movement with cars because we use the cars at the same time, in the morning and in the evening. That's a system. So bit by bit, the whole book was about all these paradoxes and this, contradictions, right? And the way we and more of that, we think we are like this, but really we are quite different. So for most of the time we are in total denial about actual, status quo or modus operandi.
Right. And those forces and those ways
Right.
of understanding
Exactly.
and operating. Yeah.
And we don't want to, and we really hate to think that this is the worst, I think, right? It's like, and this is why it's often the biggest news, that something happens that was unplanned. And I think airplane travel is the best example. It's the safest means of transportation, hands down, absolutely safest. Except when something happens, you'll be most definitely dead, right? It's over really quickly. So every time, and I had this in the beginning, because I was flying so much in my life, so you enter this tin can, and it's a perfectly stable environment and nicely designed and whatnot. And then you go up there and then the only time you're remembered that this is not normal is when you fly into super turbulences, right? When things get really violent, what I had a couple of times, utterly scary, and you think it's over until you, get out of it and you think, that also is not the end. But yeah.
The crisis stuff, where those forces
Exactly.
that
The
were
forces-
always there suddenly
Exactly.
become manifest.
And that, so we are in the end, we're just like ants. We're we are ants. And there's much bigger forces that, California is the best example, no? The way that I came out here and I think, okay, so everybody knows there will be this mega earthquake one day. It's long overdue. It's way overdue, to my understanding, and every year that passes and it's still not happening, it will be even bigger, right? Because that forces that build up more. So I'm always wondering, how can you live in California, with this understanding that this could be a 9.0 earthquake, right? Which would, with all the measures that have been put into place, talking about technology, to prepare buildings, to prepare infrastructure, to prepare a readiness of the population, this will still be total mayhem, right? So from a rational perspective, you could never live in California. I think it's sort of crazy.
Yeah.
And I'm not talking to you about the wildfires. I mean, it's like, so there's like so much going on here.
Yes.
Or
Well, what I
tsunamis
appreciate
or
that
whatnot.
too is in terms of sort of that as an analogy for kind of almost like ideology, right? You say all the forces, social forces and the like that,
Yeah.
and all of that instability, right? You know, like we're talking of one sort or another. What to say, but when you compare it to earthquake of that magnitude, it takes on this kind of sublimity, right? It's
Right,
not-
totally.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's actually weird. We're talking about visceral, right? And like event. I mean, oh,
Event.
by the way, that's what I remember. The first time I came over here, there was in '96. Yeah, because Nod, right? A human invited me for recombinant. I think Nod is AWOL, but and that was shortly after this last major earthquake, a couple of years after, whenever that happened in the '90s,
Sure.
right?
Yeah, 80s, 89.
And everybody still talked about it.
Still
and-
did.
And I met a guy who was from the experimental sound community, right? Who was like, there was all these people around Nod's orbit. And I started talking with him about earthquakes. And he said he's addicted to earthquakes. He said, because he said that there's these two crazy components that are so mesmerizing. A, that stable earth, right? That is just stable. And like rock and whatnot, solid ground becomes mobile and like moves and like it's like the opposite, right? And the other one is like the infrabase of earthquakes, the deep rumbling sounds that are created. It's like, you know, like from an infrabase addiction perspective, that's about the epitome of infrabase. Could never do this by human means. So he said every time he does an earthquake and he's not in California, he takes the next plane and flies back because he needs to feel the aftershocks. So it's like it's the weird thing. It's also superhuman, right? That we like action, we like adventure.
Or the lure of that. The lure. The
Right,
dangerous allure.
exactly, because once it happens to the point where everything becomes like super messed up, yeah, then we are not thrilled about it.
Yeah. You know, this follows. Earlier you talked about your experiential pieces and the ways in which they depend sometimes on total darkness, blackness, yes? And over the weekend I heard you referred as, or know that sometimes you are referred as a master of the void. Master of the void. And I, wonder if you could speak to that in terms of how it is that darkness and blackness and the void inform your work, but then also sort of a question in terms of these other themes that we've been discussing. Is there, between sublime earthquakes and, the anxiety in the face of death, is there a nihilism in the work?
I don't think so. I mean, it's like, I hope not. I mean, I always say I'm a cultural optimist and a political pessimist. So the point being, I absolutely believe that, it's impossible to, I mean, I think mankind is on a way to a lesser population. I think that's a given. I think the next 100 years will be, after 100 years from now, there will not be 8 billion people on this planet. I feel really quite confident about this. And not because I think that's a great thing, but it seems an obvious thing. I read about, for instance, climate change, that as of today, every year there's 50 million people on the move already because of climate change. It's a lot of people. But that's nothing compared to the billion that will have to move not very far in the future, right? If you see the predictions that by the end of the century, I do remember, not so long ago there was a prediction, maybe a foot by the end of the century, sea level rise. Now I think the average prediction is 3 feet. And the last thing I said was super fascinating, is that so anyway, to come to the more direct, to answer your question, I don't think I'm a nihilist. I'm more like trying to be not in denial about things, that are in a bad shape. I mean, so that said, the civilization as we know it was never in a good place. I mean, I come from, I'm post-war generation Austria, right? So my mother, my father were, but my mother was born 27, so she was 18 when the war ended, right? And my father was, I think they were the same age. He was in the German army and in Norway as a, 16-year-old sort of guy for the last years of the war. And so once I was old enough and I started reading all the books and cutting through Austrian mega denial about what had happened, I mean, that was like, I'd say it was not a hopeful beginning. Let's put it that way. It's just like that, and maybe that explains my state of mind generally, but then there was the Cold War. There was always this idea that, Austria would be wiped out immediately anyway, and most of Europe in a conflict between the US and Soviet Union, or the West and Soviet Union. So there was some sort of weird, and this is also, I think, why I was never like a full punk, but I was addicted to punk, right? And when it came about in my late teens, and because this idea of no future made all sense to me. That was, but that, the moment I say this, I think, how can you, if you are now, let's say, what I was then, my age then, how can you be optimistic now, right, with all these challenges? And so it didn't get that bad, right? I mean, well, not yet, but so my life was actually extremely peaceful and for the most part uninterrupted and prosperous in the West, right, versus a lot of the rest of the planet. Really needs to be pointed out. So yeah, it's a sort of a blessing of birth in this particular time.
Mm-hmm. But those conflicts and that violence is with us all the same.
It's definitely informed my work. I mean, I think that, how can it not be? I mean, I think I lived in Vienna for a long time, and the way I remember that in the beginning of Vienna, which, had this very vibrant Jewish population, and that's actually an understatement, because the Jewish Vienna was responsible for the majority of cultural everything, production, accomplishments, scientific, right?
Wittgenstein, Freud.
Just name it. Every other main Austrian of the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, is, let's say, 80%, 70% are Jewish, right? It's the brain, the Austrian brain. So to wipe that out and sort of drive out, kill, was just like extremely tragic by all means. And the country took a long time to recover from that. Helped by a really acute sense of denial, or insisting sense of denial. So yeah, I don't know, it's like, I guess that lives on in my work, yeah.
It's not a question that I anticipated, but it's interesting to, to what extent do you think of yourself as an Austrian artist? Like, do you understand yourself in the tradition of Viennese actionism and stuff like that? As, insofar as these are concerns that have a history.
I was really fascinated by that, right? For obvious reasons, also like perfectly resonated with punk, everything like this. And actionism comes out is exactly the reaction to these to this very dark coalition between the Catholic Church in Austria, which by the way was also pro-Hitler, right? I mean, so the conservative Catholic part plus all the denial about what just had happened. For instance, Peter Weibel, my professor at the time at the Academy of Vienna, at some point in a lecture he gave, mentioned that the entire cultural establishment of Austria was not replaced, that was installed by Nazi Germany and Austria, was not replaced until the 70s, late 70s. Because when the Allies came in, and this is something that not a lot of people know, when the Allies came in, very different from what the US did in Iraq, they decided, for the sake of keep the whole thing functioning, to take out the entire top management, right, of Nazi Germany, obviously. Government, top management, and upper middle management. Everything else stayed in place in order to keep society that was already completely broken down somewhat from decaying further. And in Austria, that meant that all the cultural institutions were ruled and governed and still defined by people that were put in place in the 1,000 Years Reich. I mean, it's like, I think I was so naive when he said that. I was like, my mind was blown, and I understood all of a sudden why this thing was so conservative and why this was so fucked up. Mm. So, do I feel like an Austrian? I do not feel like an Austrian, neither do I feel like an American. Which goes with this whole idea that I always feel in between anyway. I feel in between, which is, I think, the place where I feel comfortable. I feel in between, fine art, performance, theater, sound. I feel in between continents. Like after 10 years in the States, I thought I really love it here. I love New York.
I want to say
Getting emotional.
Yeah, but which is one of the things. One of the things is that you're looking at video work, of course, but basically most of his work is time-based and experiential. And this is to speak to the, do you feel like an Austrian artist? In fact, his practice, although we've lived here for 20, how long did we live here? Because I met him in Europe for 20, how long were we here? I don't remember.
It's been a long time.
Like 20 something, right? But has not been in the United States. His practice was commuting to Europe to show in a context that did not exist here.
Yeah.
And I also want to say, Montreal also, as a Euro type outpost. So the video work is more unusual and could have been shown here, but there was no context. So he would go over, have this amazingly active career where he was a famous artist, and here come back and no one knew who he is, and they still don't. So when you say, are you an Austrian or American, I think like you're a New Yorker person, because maybe most of the people in New York
I'm an prototypical New Yorker.
are
Right,
immigrants,
comes from somewhere.
Right, it's a sort of immigrant thing.
Yeah.
So I would say this context. And the second thing in relation to the context is that because there was no state-supported money that comes for the arts in America, because like we've been together 27 years, and I just retired from teaching at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. So basically, I got my money from teaching, but and he got his money from.
And that's by the way the only
European
time
art.
I earned really more money than I earned from elsewhere
Right.
in the world when I was teaching here. Right, that was the single time I made serious income here, because the art system in the States, I think, is more segmented. It's more clear cut. It has to be either art or performance, right? If you're ballet, you're ballet. If you're theater, you're theater. And anyway, and there's the beginner level or the lower level where there's no money. It's all about, you're young, you're driven, and then you can be experimental as much as you want, because there's no money to be made anyway. And then there's nothing in the middle. That's always my feeling. And then you end up, maybe you end up in the blue chip sphere,
So
and you are a millionaire.
There's
That's
nothing
about
like
it.
in America, but either an academic context that does not
Oh
promote
yeah, or you're
or
academia.
expressive or dark work. Like here's very poetic work, and I speak this personally as I'm too a media artist. So there's so you're either, if you're supported by an institutional academic system, then you make a kind of scientific academic style of work, because that's where you can show it. And then there was no way to sell media work in America until recently, an introduction of things like NFTs. But what that made for is a certain kind of very commercial work. I've shown with Bitforms Gallery for 18 years, and I'm very different from most of the artists, because most of them I'm not insulting it, as we've talked about, but I'm not that, so I don't have that as a market. It's like corporate lobby, abstract, formalistic, abstract, algorithmic work. So this idea of a more
It cannot
dark,
offend.
like a work that this is, I would say, is maybe it's not nihilistic, but it's melancholic, or it's dark, or it's whatever.
Disturbing.
It's emotionally dark.
Is it really though? There are cats in it. I tried so hard.
The cats are intense. Yeah, but so you would see in America a kind of more expressive art world. Like if you're a painter, or if you're an installation-based artist in the regular art world, you can make arty art. But in the art world, the media world, in America, you can either make academic research-based work or corporate lobby type things. But so speaking to, is he European artist, let's say, or an
Your
Austrian?
answer is yes.
It's more like being a European artist.
From the process of the work
Right,
and what
because
the type of
context
work.
is so radical.
Yeah, that's
It's
true.
European.
Yeah.
A
That is
European
really
media
true.
artist is not the same as an American media artist. It's just like a totally other beast. Yeah.
So I promised I would open the floor. I think we've broken the ice here.
Yeah, I'm another beast too.
Questions? Yeah, please.
Kurt, I don't want to alarm you, but there was a 6.2 magnitude earthquake in New York in 1944. There's no safety. There's no safety anymore.
Right, but it's a good, really super point, because New Yorkers feel totally safe.
But
right?
that's why
There's
we
no
live on
earthquake.
Staten Island.
Yeah.
Because
That's totally
it's
right.
actually this large rock that's very high above
Steady.
sea level. Yeah.
Yeah, we are out of the tsunami zone, and
Yeah.
you're sitting on serpentinite. Is that what it is?
Yes.
Like it's an ancient material, rock material, very very feeble and breaks easily. That's the basis for asbestos.
It sounds
And
like
there used to be
political
a-
politics.
There used to be a big asbestos plant in Staten Island, and I remember once I was finished with the garden, and I had moved an enormous amount of soil, and I've dug in and out. I talked to a neighbor, and he said, "Yeah, this is serpentinite. You shouldn't really do much with it." And then I read up on it, and it says, "Yeah, best not to disturb it."
Yeah.
That was really funny. But no, it's good. We're in a good spot, supposedly.
I have a question. So here, you work with technology, when you see this as an over thing,
Yeah.
right? Your vision of technology is very dark. There's always this struggle, like this guy is being enveloped in technology and screaming and trying to get out. And this is sort of like a Kubrick-like weird anxiety series of cuts, like something bad is gonna happen. And these like corpses floating around, and here we have.
But isn't that already like what I would say an American type of reading of
Yeah,
the work?
no, wait, I
Yeah.
didn't answer, I think I asked.
Oh, I see.
So like, if that's the case, why do you keep working with it? I mean, I hate technology myself, but I'm always trying to escape. You don't try to escape. So
I think
if
this
it's
is-
if it's so oppressive, why do you think you want to keep working with it?
Well, so this is really a good, I mean, I was contemplating, as you remember, to stop working with it and just become like a landscape designer or something. And by the way, we went to the Botanical Garden, or the Golden Gate Park, right? Which initially I thought from the if you look at the map, I think this is another Olmsted Park, right?
Right. You consulted.
Sort of influenced, probably likely, and it's just
We Googled.
such a glorious treat. I mean, like creation, right?
Mm.
And it's like I'm talking about time-based. I mean, there's a thing in the park about that. It actually took, I think, 50 years before they opened it. It was like it took forever, and so this is at least any park like this is a 100-year project, right? At the minimum. And there's something really absolutely beautiful. So it's alive, it's organic, but it's also like designed and created.
So you wish you were a landscape architect?
Well, maybe if I would be like 18,
Yeah.
that's what I would do now. But I'm stuck, as you know, as
Yeah.
all my creations. I'm stuck in place, and I don't know what else I could do. And I have to say, no. What changed is, I have no more. I've lost any enthusiasm for technology. I used to really love it, but yeah.
I am not a follower of linear predictive thinking. I am a scientist and a historian, a private historian. And what I have seen is that you cannot easily predict what the future is by looking at the present. Even in your history, no one would have predicted that an Adolf Hitler would come out of the brilliance of Germany and Austria. And the surprise of so many people was that how could this have happened?
Yeah.
Because they really didn't look beneath the surface to see the fragility that existed. None of the historians did. None of the people writing about it did. And they still don't understand it. And they talk about it that way with great surprise. And it's because
Again, I would generally agree. Now, you cannot predict. What I would say, in addition, is that there's certain human traits through history that seem to not change much over time. There's a reason that like the books of Franz Kafka still resonate, right? Because they speak about certain institutional systems, characters of systems, where big bodies of formalized bodies that then have all these processes and all these, committees and stuff, and it takes for a long time, and it's probably well meant and productive, but what it ends up with is sort of quite, the opposite of what was intended in the beginning. So I think
predicted a Gandhi, a Martin Luther King, all good, point out the good people who have contributed great things to our society.
yeah, but
It's
that's
easy for us to pick out the bad ones.
but that's what I'm saying. I'm saying what I said earlier was maybe not clear enough. I do not think that humankind will go away. There's no question. We are just way too flexible and smart, right? But I do. That's just my own sense of it. I'm not claiming that this is what is going to happen. My sense is that the planet will not have the same amount of people like in 100 years. And one of the reasons is climate change, and other things is like issues of sustainability that's mostly related to it. And if you look at because I mean, I was always fascinated and obsessed with history, right? So but also again, you cannot necessarily, you can read whatever about history, and you can not delineate what that means for the future. But there are certainly patterns that seem to repeat over and over again. And I think, like, for instance, what I take from the rise of Hitler in Nazi Germany is that the polarization, the extreme polarization of a society in various really hard-to-cut camps that start to hate each other does not bode well for the system. You know, where more and more like this, there's the idea of like violence in rhetoric that eventually translate into physical violence. I think is an actually has actually often proven to be, you know, pointing to some bigger turmoil down the road. It's like if you there's a reason why, as a humanist society, we believe in a civil discourse, right? The idea that it's smart to exchange ideas, however controversial, in a non-emotional way. That it's interesting to talk to each other, to listen to each other, you know, and learn from each other, right? That's a smart way, and we do this really often. This is why we are so successful, because we are the guys who do everything in iterations, and we fail and then we improve things. I mean, that's the species. So you know, I do believe that in the background, that for me, that I talked about this often, that in the years of Trump, who tried everything to diminish and stop the rise of renewable energy, it meant very little to renewable energy. It exploded anyway, and it exploded mostly because it already had critical mass, and like solar panels were so inexpensive that, you know, pretty much everybody can afford it. It's a no-brainer, right? And wind power. And if you have a farm, if you have tons of square footage that you can plaster, you get like used solar panels that are already 20 years old, from industrial farms, $50 a pop, and use batteries, and you make a renewable battery bank solar powered system that drives your entire farm for $10K, right? That will last for the next 20 years. And then eventually you'll replace it with another used system. So all of that happens. It's actually totally beautiful. I'm very optimistic about that. And, you know, but at the same time, the majority of us are still...
Not only develop that technology, there are people in politics, there are people you don't see right now, there are people who will work toward something that we don't see them. That's the point. What we do see is the negative things. It's easy to grasp the negative, very hard to grasp the good.
It's also
that could be.
Well, yeah, it's media, because we live in media space. But I also think the point of this show, that you gave this show a title. What's the title again?
Connie's Oasis.
Right. So, the point of the show to me, I wanted to ask you a couple of questions, right? Because you're creative.
Tables.
Yes. Right, that's my job. But in any case, the idea of the show, I'm speaking to what you said, is that I don't think it's about prediction, but about cultural malaise. So at any one time, you're talking about social psychology of the moment. I think that artists aren't predictors or not predictors. I think people who become artists tend to be not as rational. So you're talking about a scientific, dispassionate approach, like give me more information before I make a judgment. But artists generally, we just pick up the vibes. And I would say that the good artists pick up the vibes. As someone who's taught for many years, there are many people more academic, and I just don't think they're good artists, and they don't pick up the vibes. But I think that in terms of the point of this show, to me, it's about that this work for you expresses the cultural malaise of our time, in which people feel tremendously anxious. There's many, many wars. We have looming autocracy. Maybe things are about to get better, but if you pick up the vibes in a as Jean Marie said, in this hyper-mediated world where we're bombarded by 24/7 and social media, etc., the vibes we pick up are not dispassionate, and they're not, well, a good thing could be around the corner. As artists, we tend to express like the milieu that we're in, the vibes.
Yeah. I would definitely, I think that is on point in terms of, one orientation or my interest in this show. I would also take issue with the idea that there's anything particularly speculative. I mean, I suppose there have been speculative moments in these conversations, but if anything, I think the work is analytic, yes? And analytic, I mean in the sense of kind of unpacking experience, right? And that there may be responses to particular moments in, this moment, or historical moments, social experiences, but in that it's happening indeed at kind of a philosophical register, right? Like thinking about the nature of human relationships, or thinking about, sort of fundamental relations to the void, and so forth. And that is, again, we might sort of on that basis, again, anticipate things unfolding one way or another, but it's not so much like speculative, it's analytic to say what's it like to be a human being, and certainly in light of recent experience or even historical experience, there's all sorts of cause for concern that sensationalism doesn't actually address, right? That's in some ways kind of another way to avoid it. So.
And I have one more question for you.
Okay, yes.
So it's about the Kubrick thing.
Who said Kubrick?
I
You
did.
said that.
I did.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, but I'm asking. I'm not
I didn't
blaming
say
you.
that. Yeah.
Just asking. Yeah. So I'm just like, this does have this very Kubricky feeling to it. I don't know. That's just my intuition. Like,
Yes, well, Kubrick in the sense of
what do I mean
specifically.
by that? Can you
Yeah.
tell me what I mean?
Oh, I don't know if I can tell you what you mean by that. What I would
What
take
is
away
Ray
from it,
Rounded?
it's not 2001, it's The Shining. It's like surreal horror.
Oh yeah, right.
That's my association.
Impending doom.
Yeah.
But there's
And actually there
impending
is-
doom in all the Kubricks.
Yeah, and it's not. I wouldn't just say Kubrick either. If we're gonna go film, it's sort of Lynchian too, right? Getting too close, and it'd be like, oh, is that a body or what is it? And also like Geiger. Yeah,
Well, it's very Geiger-y.
Well, I mean,
Geiger.
Wasn't Geiger Austrian?
I think he's
no,
English.
Geiger's Swiss.
Swiss, but it's very close. Both speak strange low German dialects.
I wanna add one thing before, actually, it also, I think, fits into this idea of, certain things, I think, and again, they're not, I don't think they are predictive, but they are talking about conditions. Like, I remember, remember the first zombie movie of Romero? When was that, 80s? George Romero,
Sure,
right?
Day of the Dead.
It was a long
Yeah,
time.
Day
Day
of
of-
the
Living Dead, right?
Night of the Living Dead, right? And that was sort of, there were zombies and nobody had quite, well, and there was always the idea of zombies, but the undead. But that was more like a horror movie and a one of a kind. And then it took really a long time until sort of the late 90s, early teens. And then it became a real ever-prospering genre. And it's not just
Which you were
zombies.
obsessed with and
It was
watched
I have seen every zombie movie and every end of civilization and every viral outbreak and name it, and not because I enjoy it. And it's really true. Now it's really true. I'm not enjoying it. I find it fascinating, and I find it fascinating because I asked myself, why is there this abundance of production that everybody sort of gets magnetized to this sort of subject matter, right? Some of it is just entertainment. It's just, you know, gore and I don't know. It's like, yeah, existential mayhem, whatnot. But I'm almost done. But the point being is, at some point I realized, okay, it must be connected, I assume, to a deep-seated anxiety about civilization being like a frail, you know, the realization we're living in a thin veneer and we don't really think it's that stable, right? So that what was really fascinating to me.
I think those schools are safer.
You chose to. I don't think of the zombie movies as anything.
But I'm not promoting zombie movies. I'm saying like,
Characteristic of the zeitgeist.
and by the way, I mean,
horror is
you
bigger
know,
than ever as a commercial genre in cinema. I was actually
So-
recently with, because of being interviewed, and I was in a production studio, a big New York production studio, and the producer was telling me that the big money now in the film business is horror.
Because
Yeah.
some
Back to
really
horror,
good
yeah.
filmmakers have walked into it, like Jim Jarmusch did his Night of the Living Dead, and then Jordan Peele, all of his horror films. Like I hate horror films. I detest
yeah, me
them.
too.
But every time Jordan Peele is out there, like I am at the screening with Jordan Peele, like in the front row. Like I love
Yes, those are
Peele
great
because
movies,
everyone's
huh?
smart. And there was like the one Us, which was like the first Marxist horror film. I mean, it's like it's evolved.
But it's still a big genre. In other words, it's popular. Or just take the public temperature of the public mood is that everybody wants to go see horror films, and that's how you can guarantee profit. If you want to make a movie that
Touch
makes
that
money.
nerve, touch that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and then you will make money. So it's resonating, but also Barbie.
I think, and we kind of go back to Kubrick for one last time. Because 2001 is a really good example. It's one of my ever favorite movies for many reasons, but it's definitely not an uplifting movie. I mean, it's like, but what it does is, right, it has this utopian aspect, and then it has this dystopian, well, let's say open-ended, going nowhere outcome in a way.
It's
So
extreme
it does-
isolation, right? Like total isolation.
Yeah, isolation and somewhat, you know, again being caught and frozen somewhere.
Well, isn't
Without
irrationality
agency.
too? I mean, Hal was in his mind, and you know that sort of get to the limits of the universe, and we find ourselves.
Yeah, like, you know, like, well, this is like, I think that the drive to, I mean, you can interpret this in many ways, right? In a positive way. That's not the thing, but you know, that technology turns against you, and there's like this
It's been around for thousands of years. Go back to Greek and Roman times and their religions and their philosophies. The gods are never predictable. And they give these examples of good people and bad things.
but they are predictable.
It's
I mean,
always been
this
that
is the
way.
funny part. Like,
Yeah,
look, if you,
Climate
like,
change.
you can
Yeah.
predict that the preeminent empire of any time eventually will crumble. You can totally predict that. And like, you know, in the US, it's like, you cannot understand when, it's perfectly unclear. Could be really soon, and could be last another 100 years. It does, right? It's like, you don't know. It's a
Will
very
last it for 1,000
ingenuitive
years.
nation, very flexible still
The time
nation.
is speeded up.
But it's clear that eventually it will fall and crumble. That's just what it is, right? With
That's
enough
the warning.
decadence.
You always have to have the warning so that people protect themselves. There has to be someone who will be the Cassandra, saying, this is going to have, be aware, fix things, make it work, or it will
Right.
fall.
Yeah, that's actually, I think, part of this, you know, whole idea of fixing things in time or iterating and, you know, like improving things. Yeah, it's all like, anyway, I feel like I'm coming across as this, like, you know, really sort of dark artist. I don't feel like a dark artist at all. It's like just, you know, just do what I think is like, I don't know, what I need to do.
I find it interesting, it's the first time I see you working in reality. By the way, for full transparency, I'm also from Austria, but has nothing to do with I've been here for 30 years. But what strikes me seeing your pieces is that you don't cut. You make these abrupt camera movements. And I was wondering if that's intentionally or if it's not.
Wait, my hearing is so bad.
You said that you don't use editing software.
Well, there aren't
It's
You
all-
don't cut, you don't.
It's camera movement.
Like I go a lot into experimental music venues here in San Francisco.
Yeah.
And what I see there, there's a critical mass developing on the visual side actually. And I've taken 10 years that we've looked at and stuff.
Yeah,
But there's a lot of cutting.
of course.
But that's the old school.
Yeah,
No,
so that
it's
was
just-
interesting for me to hear. But I mean,
It just creates more action, right? I mean, this is like much more in
but
terms
you have
of
that too,
density
you
and
do
hyper.
camera movement.
But that's because it's made in a I'm sorry, but I have to tell you.
You don't
I
have
mean,
to.
no, it has to do with the software. Because,
No, you could
so-
cut in there. There's like you
No,
could
I
cut
mean,
whatever you
it's
want.
after the
recently, I
No,
have-
even in the
talent
software,
to do
just
No,
like,
it was
make a
now-
film in
now
the
it's
software.
It's a different way of making films. Like if you are working with virtuality, it means you're in a space, and within the space you have a camera. And then, so you don't need to cut, you basically animate it. If you're dealing with film, which is physical, you actually have, or it was, it's digital now. The breaking up, it became a genre of editing. It's a tradition, but it was predicated on actual physical.
And it
film.
used to just be in the experimental realm, like my early films were all
They were
really
all
fast
cut,
But
yeah.
nobody, it was only experimental filmmakers doing it, because it took a huge
They were
amount
called
of
cut.
talent.
Right,
It
but
took talent to do
post-virtual-
structural film,
Right.
and now with if you're just doing it on a computer, any idiot can put two really tight pictures together.
I don't
and
know
they
if
can keep
they're
shifting them. No, but it's just the bar to entry is very, very low.
But I think it is a different thing that happens within virtual space. And I will say that I was like, maybe it was 3 years ago, I was actually given an award or money because within experimental film context, where I was supposed to be using movie film. And 1 week after getting it, the director of the institution called me up and said, you can't have it. And I said, why? And she said, well, it's not film. And I said, why? And she said, you don't use editing software. So,
But by the way, and this is the,
but that's because they.
no, the interesting point is,
Or-
the interesting point is this software, Blender or whatnot, or any of these softwares, they have a built-in editing instance. So first of all, you can have 100 virtual cameras in there, and you can then cut between them as much as you
If
want.
you want.
I
But
can
you
make a
don't
thing in
have
there
to.
with like 1,000
Because you don't
edits and
have
But
like
you have a lot of freedom of camera
You
movement.
do
Right,
that.
You
you
have
are
a
acting,
disembodied
right.
freedom.
You're like-
Camera.
There's so many different ways to edit. My father was a film editor. I know the industry, worked for 20th Century Fox. The technology moves along,
Sure.
and you get the same final product using different methods. Whether you use AI or
Right.
you're using a splicer, doesn't make the slightest bit of difference.
Yeah.
Well,
Doesn't
that's-
it
By the way, I want to point out
That's-
who was probably the first, at least contemporary, I think of the last 500 years has been contemporary, to write about the warnings of science. And it was Mary Shelley
Mm-hmm.
who wrote Frankenstein.
Yep.
And if you read Frankenstein, you will see that it has all the elements we're talking about today. The
Exactly.
warnings of
And you
science.
It's an
all-
ongoing
and
topic.
you
They
all
never-
turn-
Well,
18 something.
we should, let's just formally wrap up our conversation here. Thanks for.
Thank you. Thanks for coming.